Ray Kurzweil is one of the world's leading inventors, thinkers, and futurists with a 30-year track and reputation of accurate predictions. Called the restless genius by the Wall Street Journal and the ultimate thinking machine by Forbes, he was selected as one of the top entrepreneurs by Inc. magazine, which described him as the rightful heir to Thomas Edison. PBS selected him as one of the 16 revolutionaries who made America. Ray Kurzweil was the principal inventor of the first CCD flatbed scanner, the first omnifont optical character recognition, the first print-to-speech reading machine for the blind, the first text-to-speech synthesizer, the first music synthesizer capable of recreating the grand piano, and the first commercially marketed large vocabulary speech recognition. Among Ray's many honors, he received a Grammy Award for Outstanding Achievement in Music Technology. He is the recipient of the American National Medal of Technology and was inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame. He holds 21 honorary doctorates and honors from 3 US presidents. Ladies and gentlemen, Ray Kurzweil.
Well, great to be with you. Maybe we could turn these lights down because I can't see all of you. I assume you're all out there. It's great to be here in Belgium. I've been here a number of times before, not in Antwerp. Ah, there you are. I knew you were there. I was looking forward to this conference, which combines entrepreneurship with a vision of the future, which is what I like to talk about. I decided I would become an inventor when I was 5. How I made that decision is another talk, but I'd like to reflect on what I've learned in the several decades that I've been inventing. I realized in the early 1980s that the key to being successful as an inventor was timing. You have to be in the right place at the right time. The inventors whose names you recognize, like Thomas Edison or my new boss, Larry Page, had an idea and they pursued it at the right time. So I started studying technology trends. I started with the common wisdom that you cannot predict the future. But being an engineer, I thought if I gathered enough data, used the right visualization tools, squinted at the visualizations, I could make some educated guesses. I made a very surprising discovery. There's one aspect of the future that's remarkably predictable, and it's the following. The overall power, the price, performance, and capacity, not of everything, not of every technology, but of every information technology, follows a very predictable trajectory. So I had, for example, the price performance of computing, calculations per second per constant dollar. I'll show you that graph in a minute. And it's a very smooth double exponential going back to the 1890 American census, the first to be automated. It's a logarithmic scale. On a logarithmic scale, a straight line is exponential growth. It's actually a slow exponential curve on a logarithmic scale, so it's doubly exponential. But the real key to it is it's totally predictable. You don't see any indication of little things that happened during the 20th century, like World War I, World War II, the Cold War, the Great Depression. People say, well, it must have slowed down during the recent recession, but that's not the case. It really has a mind of its own. It goes through thick and thin, through war and peace, through boom times and recessions, including the Great Depression. And people look at it and they go, oh, Moore's Law. But Moore's Law is just the part on the right. It's been the recent several decades of computation. This trend started decades before Gordon Moore was even born. Moore's Law, which is the shrinking of components on an integrated circuit, was the fifth paradigm, not the first, to bring exponential growth to computing. And computing is only one of the information technologies that enjoys this exponential progression. And another important point about exponentials is that's not our intuition about the future. Our intuition about the future is linear, because the kind of challenges we had when our brains were evolving many thousands of years ago were linear ones. I'd be walking through the field, I'd look up and go, okay, that animal's going that way, I'm coming up the field this way, we're going to meet at that rock. That's not a good idea. I'm going to take a different path. That turned out to be good for survival. We didn't expect that animal to speed up. We expected it to make a linear progression, which it did. That worked perfectly well. That became hardwired in our brains. But the reality of information technologies that progresses exponentially, to give you an example of the difference, halfway through the Genome Project, which was a 14-year project started in 1990, so 7 years later, 1% of the genome had been collected. Mainstream critics called it a failure because they figured, well, okay, 7 years, 1%, it's going to take 700 years, just like we said. My reaction at the time was, oh, we finished 1%, we're almost done, because 1% is only 7 doublings from 100%. And indeed, it continued to double every year. It was finished 7 years later, and that has continued since the end of the Genome Project. That first genome cost $1 billion. We're now down to $1,000. And every other aspect of biology, as in information technology, has continued to progress in an exponential manner. Our ability to understand this information, to model it, to simulate it, and most importantly, to reprogram it is also progressing in an exponential manner. So our ability to actually change this outdated software in our bodies is also progressing exponentially. And we're starting now to get clinical benefit from that. For example, immunotherapy, where we reprogram the immune system to go after cancer, which it ordinarily doesn't do. If we could turn down these lights a little bit, they're still a little bright. When our bodies were evolving, evolution was not on our side past the age of 25 because there was very limited food and other resources. So life expectancy was 19 1,000 years ago. So things that got us later on in life, like cancer, the immune system evolution did not select to go after those things, so it didn't go after cancer. Our T cells actually know how to go after cancer, but that was actually turned off because then people would live too long. So we actually can turn that back on by changing the genetic code of our T cells. Immunotherapy has been a bright spot in cancer. There are trials in which every single person in the trial goes from stage 4 terminal cancer to full remission. That is now spreading throughout all of cancer. The American Food and Drug Administration has mandated that anybody with lung cancer get this type of therapy. That's just one example of many of basically reprogramming the information processes underlying biology to extend our life. My father had a heart attack in the 60s. He could hardly walk. It's called low ejection fraction. Half of all heart attack survivors have this issue. We didn't know anything about stem cells then. You can now reprogram adult stem cells to rejuvenate the heart, something it doesn't do ordinarily. I've talked to people who could hardly walk and have been rejuvenated. We can now grow organs. I'm involved with a company where we're growing kidneys, lungs, and hearts, installing them successfully in primates. It's coming to a human near you soon. These are just a few examples. This is now a trickle of clinical application. This will be a flood over the next decade. These technologies today are thousands of times more powerful than they were when the Genome Project was completed in 2003. They will be another 10,000 times more powerful a decade from now. And it's really going to take over health and medicine. All the various statistics on life insurance and health insurance are based on these old linear models. Health and medicine used to be linear. We basically would discover things accidentally. We can now actually figure out the actual source based on the information processes underlying biology and reprogram biology to overcome these health afflictions. We'll be able to overcome most diseases and aging processes by the end of the 2020s through the exponential progression of health and medicine, which is biotechnology. And that's just one example of what I call the law of accelerating returns, which is basically the exponential growth of information technology. And as I mentioned, it's very different than our intuition about progress. People's intuition about the future is linear, even though they've seen many examples of exponential progressions. 30 steps linearly, that's our intuition about the future, gets you to 30. 30 steps exponentially, that's the reality, not of everything, but of every information technology, gets you to 1 billion. Makes a very profound difference. Your smartphone is more than 1 billion times more powerful than the computer I used when I went to MIT in the mid-1960s. In fact, I went to MIT because it was so advanced that it actually had a computer. Most colleges I looked at didn't have one. It was an IBM 7094, had 32,000 words of memory. Your smartphone is billions of times more powerful, and it's about 1 billion times less, about 1 million times less expensive. So that's many billion-fold increase in price performance. And it's also 100,000 times smaller. Miniaturization is another exponential trend. This is all part of what I call the law of accelerating returns. And it has profound impact on every aspect of life. These are some of the implications of the law of accelerating returns. Any questions on any of this? Okay, I'll go through it a little more slowly. So here's that first graph I had. I had it in 1981. I had it through 1980. This graph goes through 2010. We've just updated it to 2016. It continues on this curve. As I mentioned, and I had it through 1980 and 81. We're now 36 years later, and it's exactly where it should be, so I'm not just overfitting to past data. And look at how smooth a progression this is. This is a logarithmic scale, so this little curve represents trillions-fold increase in the amount of computation you can get for the same cost. 1 billion-fold just since I was an undergraduate in college. But look at how smooth a progression this is. It's only the part on the right that has to do with Moore's law, has to do with chips. This started almost a century before that. Where is World War I on this graph, or World War II, or the Cold War, or the Great Depression? People say, well, it must have slowed down during the recent 2008 recession, but that's not the case. It has a mind of its own. It goes through war and peace, through boom times and recessions. And I have a mathematical treatment in my book, The Singularity is Near, as to why this is the case. But it's really the empirical data that's the most convincing. And it's not just computation. It's every other aspect of information technology. Here you could, this is the price of a transistor. You could buy a transistor for $1. In 1968, you can now get 10 billion for $1. And they're better because they're smaller, so the electrons have less distance to travel, so they're faster. The cost of a transistor cycle comes down by half every year. That's a measure of price performance. That's why you can get an iPhone or an Android phone that's twice as good as the one 2 years ago for half the price. That's a quadrupling of price performance. That's a 50% deflation rate. We put some of that improved price performance into price. We put some of it into performance. And it's a very smooth progression, and it affects all of electronics. Now, economists worry about deflation. That's a 50% deflation rate. The concern is if you can get twice as much stuff and I'll talk about physical stuff in a moment. It's not just electronic capability. For the same price each year, we'll buy more, but are we actually going to double our consumption year after year? And if we don't, let's say we increase our consumption 50%. We buy 50% more computation, more communication, more genetic sequencing than we did a year ago. Then the size of the economy, not as measured in bits, bytes, and base pairs, but as measured in constant currency, will shrink. For a variety of good reasons, that would be a bad thing, but that's actually not what happens. Here's bits of memory shipped, and I have consumption charts of every form of information technology. We more than double our consumption to keep up with this doubling of price performance. In fact, there's been 18% growth in constant currency of every form of information technology each year, despite the fact you can get twice as much of it each year for the same cost. And the reason for that is what SuperNova and all of you celebrate and practice, which is innovation. We invent new capabilities that didn't exist before. In fact, they're waiting in the wings, waiting for the price performance to catch up with it. Why didn't we have social networks 10 years ago? The reason is the price performance just wasn't there. 20 years ago, we didn't have the price performance to do search engines. I had actually written in the early 80s that by the late 90s, the World Wide Web, I didn't use that name, it was called the ARPANET in the early 80s. It's basically connected 1,000 American scientists to each other in 1981. But I saw that it was doubling every year, did the math, and said, wow, this is going to connect hundreds of millions of people to each other and to vast knowledge resources by the late 1990s. We won't be able to find anything, so we'll need search engines. And the computation and communication resources to create an effective search engine would be in place by then. And that is, in fact, exactly what happened. Now, a prediction I was not able to make is that among the 50 different projects to create an effective search engine, there'd be these couple of kids in a Stanford dorm who would take over the world of search. If I made that prediction, I wouldn't have to work very hard today. But the reality of a search engine and the ability to find information, ultimately to find all of human knowledge, was predictable. So this is, on the right, the number of bits we move around wirelessly in the world. Over the last century, this is a logarithmic scale. This again represents trillions-fold increase. This was Morse code over AM radio a century ago. It's 4G networks today. But again, look at how smooth and predictable a trajectory that is. On the left, that's the size of the internet as measured in hosts. So I had just the first few points of that in the early 80s, predicted a World Wide Web emerging in the late 90s. On the right is the same data, but seen on a linear scale, and that's how we experience it. We don't experience it in the logarithmic domain. So to the casual observer, it looked like, wow, World Wide Web came out of nowhere in the mid-1990s, but you could see it coming. And I alluded to this. This is information technology applied to biology. It's been a perfect exponential in terms of the amount of genetic data, the cost of sequencing, and every other aspect of biology is now being transformed in this way. And this is a new paradigm, and it's just reaching the edge of clinical practice, able to basically reprogram this outdated software that runs in our bodies. And that's not a metaphor. Genes are sequences of data. They evolved a long time ago when conditions were different. Evolution was not on your side after the age of 25. Evolution was on the side of the species. It was in the interest of species for people not to live very long because there was limited food and other resources. So it did not select for long life. We can now redo that. We can reprogram it. That's exactly what we're doing. And a whole issue of promise versus peril has attended what's called biotechnology. 40 years ago, it was realized that there's both promise and peril in biotechnology. The same technology, for example, that enables us to reprogram your T cells to go after cancer could be used by a bioterrorist to reprogram a benign virus like a flu virus to become far more deadly, communicable, and stealthy. So 40 years ago, they held a conference in Asilomar, California, came up with guidelines on how to keep biotechnology safe. They're called the Asilomar Guidelines. They've been updated every few years. It's not a pat solution, but so far it's worked. We're now getting profound clinical impact. That's going to become a flood over the next decade. So far, the number of people who've been harmed by either inadvertent or intentional abuse of biotechnology has been zero, approximately zero. That doesn't mean we can cross it off our list and say, okay, we took care of that one, because the technology keeps getting more sophisticated. But it is a good paradigm for how we can reap the promise while we control the peril. All these major emerging information technologies, biotechnology is really the first to have profound impact and also existential risk. AI is coming along. I'll talk about that in a moment. Nanotechnology also has profound promise versus peril. So this is a good paradigm, how to reap the promise while we control the peril. This is also being applied to issues that we don't ordinarily think of as information technology, like physical products. I had an onstage dialogue with Christine Lagarde, head of the International Monetary Fund, at her annual meeting. And she said, yes, digital technology is amazing. She acknowledged there's exponential progress in the price performance and capacity of information technology. But she said, you can't eat information technology. You can't wear it. You can't live in it. We can't power our air conditioners with it. And my next point was all of that's going to change. These nominally physical technologies are going to become information technologies. That's just emerging. For example, 3D printing, that revolution hasn't happened yet. We've had a false start. I've written about the life cycle of technologies. Usually there are early visionaries who prematurely sort of announce victory. That was the case, for example, of the internet. Some of you look like you're old enough to remember the internet craze of the 1990s. If you had the website address dog.com, you were a billionaire. But then around the year 2000, the financial community said, no, wait a second, you can't really make money on these internet companies. And we had the internet crash that almost took down the world's economy. But then it came back, and now we have little internet companies like Google and Microsoft and Amazon and so on that are worth trillions of dollars together. The same thing is going to happen with 3D printing. We had our false start. That will become a mature technology in the 2020s. For exciting applications like, for example, printing out clothing, you need submicron resolutions. We need faster speed. All of that's progressing exponentially. We'll be there in the early 2020s. So you'll then be able to print out clothing for pennies per pound, which is what it costs. There'll be an open source market where you can download designs for free, dress very well, at almost no cost. Coexisting with that, though, will be a proprietary market where you can download at some greater cost designs by your favorite designer. We see the same thing in other areas like music, books, movies, where, in fact, you can have a very good time with these free digital products, of which there are millions of books that are free, that legally, that you can download. Music, movies, but people still spend money to read Harry Potter or see the latest blockbuster movie. And there is now the coexistence of a free open source market, which is a great leveler, and a proprietary market. And that'll be the nature of the economy going forward. So clothing will become another type of digital product that ultimately you can download for free or not. But that will transform the nature of clothing. Food, we're going to go from horizontal agriculture, which now takes up 40% of our usable land, to vertical agriculture, where we grow food with no chemicals, recycling all the nutrients, in vitro cloned muscle tissue for meat, hydroponic plants for fruits and vegetables. This has been demonstrated. This will be a mainstream technology and bring this very high deflation rate from information technology to food production, which will basically become an information technology. It's already been demonstrated that you can use a 3D printer to print out little modules, snap them together like Lego bricks, and create housing and buildings. A 3-story office building was recently put together in Asia in a matter of days using this method. It was a demonstration. This will be a mainstream technology in the 2020s. So physical products that we don't ordinarily think of as information technology are going to be able to benefit from this very profound deflation rate. So the digital world has been thought of as economists as having the economics of abundance, but it's kind of a strange world where we can do things that have to do with information, but otherwise the world is still the old world of scarcity. All of that's going to change as we go through the 2020s. And here I have an example of energy. So we're applying supercomputing to coming up with new materials, both for energy storage and collection of solar energy. As a result, the costs both of producing solar energy and storing it are coming down quite dramatically. As a result, we see exponential growth in the usage of solar and other renewables. It's doubling every 2 years. Total renewables is now about 6%. At 2 years each, before 2030, we'll be able to provide all of our energy needs, ultimately at very low cost, using completely renewable energy. I presented this recently to the Prime Minister of Israel, who actually was in my class at the Sloan School in the 1970s. And he said, "Ray, do we have enough sunlight to do this with, to double what at that time was 7 more times?" And I said, yes, when we double 7 more times and are meeting 100% of our energy needs from solar, we'll be using 1 part in 10,000 of the sunlight that falls on the Earth. So this is just another example of how we will use the economics and the profound deflation rate of information technology that's now attending nominally information products to nominally physical products like energy and food and clothing and housing. Finally, then she said, okay, there's one resource that's not an information technology, which you can't grow this way, which is land. We're very crowded together. That's not going to grow exponentially. And I said, actually, we're not crowded together. Try taking a train trip anywhere in the world, and you'll see 95% of the usable land is not used. So we've decided artificially to crowd ourselves together. Cities was a very early invention so that we could work and play together. Ultimately, we'll be able to overcome that by spreading out. We're already doing that. My work group at Google is all over the world, and we're able to work together. It's not exactly as good yet as being together, but ultimately, when virtual reality and augmented reality becomes highly realistic, which it will by the end of the 2020s, we'll be able to work and play together just like we're physically together, and we'll be able to live anywhere we want and use all of that 95% of the usable land that's currently not used. So I mentioned miniaturization is another exponential trend. We're shrinking technology at a rate of 100 in 3D volume per decade. It's an exponential miniaturization. We will reach the ability to have medical nanorobots, basically devices the size of blood cells that have computers, computation, communication, storage tanks, actuators, and they will act just like your T cells. They'll be programmed to combat disease, both by actually going after pathogens like cancer cells, which your T cells are not programmed to do, although we can reprogram them, which is what we're doing with immunotherapy. They'll also be able to overcome metabolic diseases. Lots of diseases are not pathogens, like viruses and bacteria and cancer cells. They have to do with malfunction of your organs, like type 1 diabetes is a malfunction of your pancreas. If you think about what all the organs in your body do, aside from the heart and the brain, they either put something in the bloodstream or they take something out. So the lungs put in oxygen, take out carbon dioxide. The kidneys take out toxins. Your entire digestive tract puts in nutrients. And malfunction of these organs are diseases. And so another job of these medical nanorobots will be to measure the bloodstream for optimal levels of these resources, put some in, take some out, ferry out toxins, ferry in nutrients or hormones, basically overcome malfunction of your organs. There are detailed designs on what to do for every disease and aging process. There's several thousand-page treatises by Robert Friedis and Ralph Merkel, who are the founders of the nanotechnology track at Singularity University, which I co-founded. So we actually know how to overcome every disease and aging process if we had the enabling factor of the medical nanorobots. We know exactly how to build those if we have the enabling factor of atomically precise manufacturing or fabrication. This was a vision that Eric Drexler expressed in his 1986 doctoral dissertation at MIT, and under actually Marvin Minsky, who was my mentor. And we don't have atomically precise fabrication yet. We're moving in that direction. We can create very intricate structures at the molecular level, not yet the atomic level. There are roadmaps to get to that. The more conservative ones have that emerging by the end of the 2020s. I'm quite confident in the 2030s we'll be able to create atomically precise structures which will enable us to create these medical nanorobots, which will enable us to overcome essentially every disease and aging process, not instantly, but it'll be a very powerful new tool to apply to health and medicine. I've written 3 health books, the last 2 with Terry Grossman, MD. We talk about 3 bridges to radical life extension. Bridge 1 is what you can do right now, basically being healthy and taking the right supplements and right exercise and stress management to slow down aging processes. And for example, I take a lot of supplements, and people say, you really think that taking these supplements are going to enable you to live hundreds of years? And the answer is no. The goal of Bridge 1 is to get to Bridge 2, which is not far away. It's already rolling out. That's biotechnology. And Bridge 2 will be fully in place by the end of the 2020s. And that'll bring us to Bridge 3 in the 2030s, these medical nanorobots, which basically will augment the immune system to essentially overcome every disease. I believe we will achieve what's called longevity escape velocity, which is we're adding more time than is going by, not just to infant life expectancy, but to your remaining life expectancy. So the sands of time will start running in rather than running out by the end of the 2020s, if you're diligent. And I think this is a diligent group, so if you pay attention to sort of cutting-edge advances, by around 2030, I believe you'll be able to achieve longevity escape velocity. Now, longevity is a statistical phenomena. You could have a computed longevity of whatever, 50 years, still be hit by the proverbial bus tomorrow. We're working on that also with self-driving vehicles. So if you hang in there, I think you'll be able to see this remarkable future. So finally, that brings us to artificial intelligence. That's been my main interest. I got involved in this 56 years ago, 1962, when I was 14. I met the 2 leaders of the field, Marvin Minsky, who headed up the Symbolic School, which was defining artificial intelligence in terms of the rules of intelligent behavior, and then Frank Rosenblatt, who headed up what's called the Connectionist School, basically neural nets, where we don't program any rules and let a self-evolving system, self-organizing system, discover its own rules by being fed a lot of data. And these two schools fought it out. The connection school is very much in ascendancy now. I went up to see Dr. Rosenblatt, and he had a machine called the Perceptron. It had a camera, so I brought printed letters, and it was able to recognize the letters perfectly, so long as they were Courier 10. When I showed the camera a different type style, it didn't work. And he said, but don't worry, I can take the output of one Perceptron, it was a single layer neural net, and feed it as the input to another Perceptron, and take the output of that and feed it to a third one, keep doing that, and as I add more layers, it'll get smarter and generalize. It's not obvious that that would work. And I said, well, that's interesting. I said, it's not obvious that will work. Have you tried that? And he said, well, no, it's high on our research agenda. Well, things didn't move quite as quickly in the 60s as they do today. He died in 1971, 9 years later, never having tried that idea. But it's amazingly prescient, because all this excitement you hear now about artificial intelligence are these multi-layer neural nets. The system that defeated the human Go champion was a 100-layer neural net. Now, there's still a problem in the field. There's a motto that says, life begins at 1 billion examples. So if you have 1 billion examples of labeled data, like, for example, 1 billion pictures of dogs and cats, and they're labeled, this one's a dog, this one's a cat, then you can create fantastically accurate perception. And these systems outperform humans on, for example, recognizing 1,000 categories of images. But we don't always have 1 billion examples. So take the example of this recent victory in Go. DeepMind, the Google subsidiary in London, took every online move of master human Go playing. But it's not 1 billion moves. It was 1 million moves. And that's not 1 billion. So that was enough to create kind of a fair amateur player. If you were a good amateur, you could defeat it. So they needed another 999 million moves. Where are they going to get that? Well, an idea that came up, and actually my team at Google was involved in this, was to simulate the game of Go, which is very easy. You just have to program the rules. You can do that in a few hundred lines of code, and have the system play itself, and you can annotate the moves because you know retroactively which side of the simulated game have ultimately won, and there's other ways to annotate the quality of moves. And so they kept training it with its own generated moves by playing itself. And then they could watch the kind of Go score just increase as they kept doing that, and it just soared past the best human. And then subsequently, AlphaZero had an innovation in how they annotated the moves, and that soared past AlphaGo with no human training. So we can actually create systems to be far better than humans at a task if we can simulate the world it's operating in. So where else can we do that? It's being done now in math. Math is actually not that hard to simulate. It's hard to prove new mathematical theorems, but it's easy to test out if they're accurate. So it's being applied to coming up with new theorems. How about a complicated real-world issue, like, for example, the world of driving? So this is being done by the Google subsidiary. They've gone 8 million miles in real-world traffic. That was enough to generate data to create a realistic simulator of the world of driving. And they've driven a simulated car in the simulator for 1 billion miles. And that, in turn, was enough to create data now to train the neural nets to significantly improve the algorithms. So this is actually working in a complicated situation that's not a simple situation like the world of Go. So how about the world of medicine and biology? Now you might think, oh, well, that's just infinitely complicated. It's actually not that much more complicated than the world of driving. The world of driving, all the kinds of real-world situations that can happen, like a kid running after a ball in the street and a dog wandering in the street, it's actually very complicated. The world of biology is complicated, but not infinitely so. The genome, the entire human genome, it has 3 million rungs, 2 bits per rung, that's 6 million bits, it's 800 million bytes, but it's replete with redundancies. One sequence called ALU is repeated 300,000 times. So those of you with a math background know that if you have redundancies in data, you can compress it with lossless compression. In other words, you can compress it with no loss of information by getting rid of the redundancy. So I have an analysis in my book, The Singularity is Near. If you apply lossless compression to the human genome, you end up with 50 million bytes. Now that's not simple, but it's actually not that complicated. 50 million bytes, that would fit on an old floppy disk. And we can manage that level of complexity. And we are making progress in creating simulators for the world of biology. In fact, the US Food and Drug Administration will now accept simulated trials on biological simulators to approve vaccines, which is good because we don't have years to do human trials on vaccines if it's, this year's flu vaccine. And we're making progress towards really being able to simulate biology. We will get there by the late 2020s, and it's not going to happen all at once. We already have crude simulators. They will become more refined each year. Once we have a simulator, we can do a human trial in hours rather than years. We'll be able to generate enough data through simulation to actually use deep learning to discover new medicines and new approaches to medicine. So that's where we're headed in terms of applying AI to health. So that same year, 1962, when I met these two leaders, I came up with a thesis on how I thought the human brain worked. And I described it not as one big neural net, but as actually millions of little nets, each of which could learn a pattern. And the brain would organize these modules in a hierarchy based on its own experience. That's as far as I got. I won a science contest, got to meet President Johnson. That initiated 50 years of thinking about this. 50 years later, in 1962, I came out with this book, How to Create a Mind, that articulates the same thesis. Now there's a plethora of neuroscience evidence from the brain reverse engineering projects, most notably the one here in Europe under Henry Markram. He's actually seen these modules, about 100 neurons each, and we can actually see them creating a hierarchy in real time. We can see axons coming from other modules as the input to a module, and then the one output axon from that module is the input to another module. So we see them organized in a hierarchy. We can now count them. There's about 300 million of these modules. So it's not one neural net, it's 300 million simple neural nets. And one of the advantages of this is that this actually can learn from less data. So I gave a copy of this book in 2012 to Larry Page. He liked it. He recruited me to develop these ideas at Google. And so that's what I've been doing. For those of you that use Gmail in English, you'll notice it gives you 3 suggestions to respond to each email. It's called Smart Reply. We're coming out in other languages now. And that's using this hierarchical model of the neocortex, basically a hierarchy of modules that self-organize. Something you can try is called Talk to Books. So if you Google Talk to Books, the first link, just click on that. And then you can ask a question. It can be any question. It works well on kind of open-ended, evocative questions like, what's the goal of music? Or what will make me happy? Or what question should I ask at SuperNova? And the software then will read 100,000 books, 600 million sentences in a half a second, which is pretty good. I mean, it takes me hours to read 100,000 books. And it will give you the best excerpts from those 100,000 books that answer the question. And it comes up with sort of very interesting and unexpected answers. It's a very good idea generator. So we're developing this model of the neocortex. It's not perfect. We don't fully understand the neocortex. There's some issues we don't completely understand, particularly how the human brain creates this hierarchy. We have ideas about it that we've implemented, but we will learn more about it as we continue to make exponential progress in reverse engineering the brain. Our information on the brain and the resolution of brain scanning is growing exponentially. We can now see individual connections forming in real time, firing in real time. That image on the top there, that's the neocortex. That's familiar to you. The brain has this sort of curved outer layer. The neocortex is the outer layer, and it has these curvatures. The neocortex emerged 200 million years ago in mammals. Only mammals have a neocortex. And the neocortex has this hierarchical structure. And that hierarchy and our ability to create this hierarchy with our own thinking is what enables humans, or really any mammal, to be innovative, to be creative. About 65 million years ago, there was a sudden violent change to the environment. We call it the Cretaceous extinction event. That's when the dinosaurs went extinct. That's when 75% of all the animal and plant species went extinct. And that's when mammals overtook their ecological niche. And so now mammals got bigger. Our brains got even bigger at a faster pace. The neocortex got bigger faster than that by developing these curvatures. 2 million years ago, another thing happened, which was we got these big foreheads. So basically, evolution said to itself, well, this neocortex is pretty good stuff. Let's have more. And so it created a larger enclosure. And so we got additional neocortex. Now, we were already doing a very good job of being primates, so that additional neocortex is put at the top of the hierarchy. So now the hierarchy got bigger. And as you go up the hierarchy, things get more interesting. At the bottom of the hierarchy, I can tell that that's a straight line. At the top of the hierarchy, I can tell, oh, that's funny, that's ironic, she's pretty. We make more profound judgments at the top of the hierarchy. So that additional neocortex we got 2 million years ago, that was the enabling factor for us to invent language and art and music. Every human culture we've ever discovered has music. No primate culture has music or language. There's debates about that, but it's basically true. But that was a one-shot deal. We couldn't keep growing the enclosure without making birth impossible. In fact, the size of the skull made birth actually very challenging, but it still kind of worked. We're going to do it again. As we go to the 2030s, there's going to be 3 applications of these medical nanorobots. So here's one of these 300 million modules. They're organized in a hierarchy, and we're going to put them at the, we're going to create synthetic neocortex in the cloud. Now, we're doing that already crudely. That's what my team is doing. So we have synthetic neocortex based on our crude models today of the neocortex. But by the 2030s, these models will be very accurate. They really will simulate what the neocortex can do. And just as your phone makes itself 1 million times more capable by connecting wirelessly to the cloud. I mean, think about it. If it couldn't connect wirelessly to the cloud, it couldn't do any of the exciting things that it does do. And these are already brain extenders. They enable us to do things we couldn't do otherwise. None of us could do our jobs or run our businesses or get our education without these brain extenders. They're not inside our brains yet, but they may as well be. We don't leave home without them. We ultimately will, these medical nanorobots, they'll keep us healthy, they'll provide full immersion, virtual and augmented reality from within the nervous system, but most significantly, it will connect the upper layers of our neocortex to synthetic neocortex in the cloud. So just the way your smartphone makes itself smarter by connecting wirelessly to the cloud, we'll do that directly from our brains. And it'll be just like 2 million years ago, where we got this additional neocortex. And just like 2 million years ago, we'll put it at the top of the neocortical hierarchy. But unlike 2 million years ago, it won't be a one-shot deal, because the cloud is doubling in power every year as we speak. That will continue. So we'll be able to actually create more and more non-biological intelligence. And we'll put it at the top of the neocortical hierarchy. So we'll be able to create new forms of music, new forms of language, new forms of expression that we couldn't even understand today, just as primates that missed out on this neocortical expansion 2 million years ago can't understand what we're doing. Try explaining this conference or your favorite song or your favorite movie to a primate that missed out on this neocortical expansion of 2 million years ago. You could talk all day or all year, and that primate won't understand what you're talking about. Similarly, we will be able to create and understand profound new concepts as we get to the 2030s and 2040s. I've been very consistent that AI will achieve human levels of intelligence in every area where humans are intelligent by 2029. We can see that once a computer achieves a human level, it very quickly soars past it. So talk to books, which I mentioned, it's not at human levels, but it does read 100,000 books in a half a second, so it's much faster than humans. Once it can read at human levels, it'll be able to read 1 million times faster than humans and be able to sort of comprehend all of that knowledge. We saw with Go where it went from sort of fair amateur performance to way beyond the best human and then soared past that a few months later. That's the nature of artificial intelligence. But this is not an alien invasion of intelligent machines from Mars to compete and displace us. We've always created technology to go beyond our limitations. 1,000 years ago, we couldn't reach fruit at that higher branch, so we created a tool that extended our reach. I mean, who here could build this building with your bare hands? So we leverage our muscles with our machines. And who here could search through all human knowledge, which a kid in Africa with her $75 smartphone can do? And that wasn't the case 10 years ago. And this is benefiting human well-being. We are improving human well-being. The perception is the opposite. There was a poll taken of 26,000 people in 24 countries, and they were asked, for example, is worldwide poverty getting better or worse over the last 20 years? 87% said it's getting worse, but that's wrong. Only 1% identified correctly that it has fallen by 50% or more. And there's been similar disparities between the polls and the reality on many other measures of human well-being, like violence. People think, oh, the world's getting more violent. And why do they think that? Because every time they turn on the media, social media or television, all they see is violence. So our information about what's wrong with the world is getting exponentially better, but this is actually the most peaceful time in human history. So every aspect of human life is getting better. People think, oh, employment's getting worse. In the United States, and the statistics are similar in Europe, we went from 24 million jobs in 1900 to 142 million today, from 30% of the population to 45% of the population. The average job pays 11 times as much in constant dollars per hour than it did in 1900. The jobs are more interesting. We have 20 million people in colleges and teaching kids in college. There was 58,000 college students in 1870 in the United States. So that's a whole nother speech, but this type of technology is improving human well-being. There are profound existential risks. I alluded to the ones in biotechnology. We have strategies, but it's not a pat solution. That's why people need to get involved with social issues and politics so that we can set the right priorities. Thank you very much.
Ray Kurzweil, can I ask you to come over here? And I am asked some questions from Twitter. The first question is, talking about the brain and the mind and creating a mind, do you expect that there also will be an exponential growth in intellect in dealing with all these new evolutions? Will we become exponentially smarter as human species?
Well, yes, and that's not something that's reserved for the future. We're already exponentially smarter. As I mentioned, nobody here could do their work or run their businesses or get their education without the brain extenders we already have. We're profoundly more capable, and our expectations and standards have risen. You were happy to get a backbreaking job that puts food on your family's table a century ago. And I talk to young people around the world, and their expectations very much is what can they do that's meaningful. The expectations is to have purpose in the world. That's the goal. We're moving up Maslow's hierarchy, but we are smarter, and we're going to do that very directly by connecting to AI in the cloud from our brains.
How would schools and education would have to evolve in this new evolution?
Yeah. Well, my philosophy on education is learn by doing. So if I think about what I've managed to learn in my life and career, it's been from my projects. I have a passion to create something, and I have a vision of what that'll be. Whether that succeeds or fails, I'll succeed in learning something. And that's a philosophy you can bring to education. As I mentioned, I co-founded Singularity University in California, and the philosophy there is learn by doing. The students self-organize into small teams, and they take on a world challenge, like bringing clean water to the developing world, or cleaning up debris in space. And whether they succeed or not in those grand missions, they will succeed in learning something. And many of those projects are moving in that direction. And there are schools that can be done really at every level. My grandson is in a school that celebrates learn by doing. So the kids take on projects. Oh, I'm going to have to actually learn to read in order to do this project, so I better go do that. So that's my philosophy.
There were several questions on how do you make sure that technology does not only solve the problem of the rich. For instance, you talked about medical breakthroughs. Even if costs go down, how do you make sure that medical companies do not just seek profit because they own the patents, they own the technology?
Well, I'm not opposed specifically to profit, but that is a common challenge. Only the wealthy are going to be able to benefit from these technologies that I talk about. And my response is, yeah, like smartphones, where in fact you had to be rich 20 years ago to have a smartphone. If somebody took out not a smartphone, just a portable phone. Someone took out a portable phone in a movie 20 years ago, that was a signal that this was a member of the power elite. But he or she didn't take it out of their pocket because they were the size and weight of a brick. It did one thing poorly, which is maybe make a phone call. So now we have devices that can make calls and do a million other things. And there are 3 billion smartphones. There's 8 billion smart devices, all connected to the cloud. Today, there'll be 6 billion smartphones in a couple of years. And that's because of this 50% deflation rate. We put some of that improved price performance in price, so prices come down. So your smartphone, I mean, it costs a few $100s. That computer that MIT had I went there because I had a computer, cost $88 million in today's cost. So ultimately, these technologies get more and more capable. They get more widely distributed. It's not like the futurist dystopian movies where you've got the AI, like the Terminator, and there's one or two of them versus a brave band of humans for control of humanity. We already have billions of them, and they're in all of our hands. And it is very much enabling all the populations of the world. Many societies in the developing world just skip the infrastructure of things like a wired telephone system and go right to these decentralized communication technologies.
You're in Flanders. Flanders has an aging population. How you see the world dealing with the problems of longevity, and will we ever reach immortality? Is that thinkable?
You're asking about how we can have a...
People live longer. That gives a number of challenges.
So we will begin to decrease the death rates in the 2030s. Even if we dramatically reduce the death rate, the doubling time of the biological population is going to be very slow. The first effect of increasing prosperity is that the reproduction rate goes down. So the population growth becomes negative. That's the first implication of increasing prosperity. When we dramatically reduce the death rate, the biological population will grow slowly, but the doubling time will still be on the order of 20 years. The doubling time of the power of these technologies, because it has a 50% deflation rate, is like 1 year. It'll more than be able to keep up with it. In fact, we can see a vision of extreme prosperity where we can produce the physical things we need, food through vertical agriculture, clothing through 3D printing, other physical things we need, including modules to snap together our housing, very inexpensive renewable energy, all of which is emerging with a very substantial deflation rate. So we're entering an era of extreme abundance. We'll be able to meet the physical needs of an expanding biological population.
You predicted a technical evolution, a technology era. You said the next area is the biology era. Logical question is, what is the next era? What comes after?
Well, we see overlapping revolutions. There's three major ones. I alluded to biotechnology, and you mentioned that. That was enabled by the Genome Project. That was a perfect exponential. I showed you that curve. The amount of genetic data doubled every year. The cost came down by half every year. That's continued. And every aspect of biology as an information technology has progressed in that exponential manner. That's now reaching clinical impact. It's still on the kind of cutting edge. Immunotherapy is still kind of being experimented with, but this is going to transform health and medicine over the next decade. Very close on its heels is artificial intelligence. Certainly, those of you who run businesses realize that AI is already transforming every aspect of business. That's going to become far more profound. The exponential progression is even faster than it is for biology. The amount of computation we're deploying for deep learning is actually doubling every 3 months. So it's multiplying by 16 every year. We're already far beyond the amount of computation we need to emulate the human brain. These little boards that are used for deep learning run about 10 to the 16th calculations per second. That's over 100 human brain equivalents. We don't have the software for human-level intelligence in every area, but the number of areas where AI can perform beyond human levels is increasing. And once it achieves human levels of something, it soars way past it. Take something much more complicated than Go, like language. In grade school, you took these tests where you read a paragraph and then answer questions about it to show that you understood the paragraph. It's language comprehension. 6 years ago, when I came to Google, computers were at the second grade level. Now they can actually do better than adults on paragraph comprehension. So it's making very rapid progress, and that's going to transform every aspect of human life. And nanotechnology, I think, will come in the 2030s, where you can build things at the atomic level, fantastically powerful computation, medical nanorobots, which will be the third bridge to radical life extension, and so on.
Ladies and gentlemen, your applause for Ray Kurzweil.